Welcome everyone to today's presentation. I know that this is a very busy time of the year for most of you, especially if you're working in the schools, so thanks for joining in today. As Nancy said, my name is Patricia Ibarra. I'm a research director employed by Pearson Clinical Assessment, and I'm also a bilingual speech-language pathologist. I have no relevant non-financial relationships to disclose. The Pearson Assessment Division develops and distributes assessment and intervention tools for speech-language pathologists. Course information will only cover information that pertains to the effective and appropriate use of GFTA-3 Spanish, which was developed by Pearson Clinical Assessment. No other assessments will be discussed. Today's agenda will include the following. We'll have an introduction and a little bit of an overview of GFTA-3 Spanish. I'll talk about how to administer and score the test, as well as interpretation and recommendations. And we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. If you have questions during the presentation, there's a little chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type in your questions, and if they're not addressed during the presentation, I'll address them at the end of the presentation. By the end of the presentation, you'll be able to describe why it is important to examine an individual's speech sound productions in multiple contexts rather than in a single instance in each position of a word. Explain how to use age and gender-based information provided by the GFTA-3 Spanish to determine if the individual is beginning to produce developmentally appropriate speech sounds at either an emerging or mastery level. And you'll be able to explain how to use information in the GFTA-3 manual and record form to identify the age at which speech sounds should be produced correctly at least 85% of the time. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of GFTA-3 Spanish and its components, given that everyone here may have a different level of experience with this test. These are the components of the GFTA-3 Spanish. They're all labeled in Spanish. They include the manual, which is the examiner's manual, the manual de estímulos, or the stimulus book, and the protocolos, or the record form. GFTA-3 Spanish is a research-based comprehensive articulation assessment that is brief and easy to administer. For most individuals, it takes 15 minutes to administer the sonidos en palabras, or sounds in words, and the sonidos en oraciones, or sounds in sentences, test. GFTA-3 Spanish offers multiple opportunities to produce 17 consonants and 11 RNL clusters in the prevocalic, intervocalic, and postvocalic position of syllables. The production of each consonant is accounted for in the final score. There are two sets of picture stimuli within the manual de estímulos, a set of cartoon-style pictures for younger individuals ages 2 years to 6 years, 11 months, and a set of realistic-style pictures for older individuals ages 7 years to 21 years, 11 months. The test provides norm reference scores for an individual's speech sounds abilities in the areas of articulation at the word level. GFTA-3 Spanish also offers norm reference scores at the connected speech level for ages 4 and older. Information about the emergence and mastery of speech sounds is provided. Responses to GFTA-3 Spanish test items may contain regional and cultural patterns or variations that reflect dialectal differences in Spanish. Spanish dialectal or regional variations are considered correct responses. With GFTA-3, you can also rate intelligibility of connected speech. The Sonidos en Oraciones test measures and compares an individual's intelligibility to the intelligibility of other individuals the same age and gender. Both tests are available in both print and digital formats, and there'll be more detailed information about these features on subsequent slides. GFTA-3 Spanish has unique art, but also shares art with GFTA-3 English. So if you're familiar with GFTA-3, you're going to recognize some of the images that both tests have in common, including the iconic little duck or pato, that you see on the right side of your slide. However, there are many targets and images that are only found in the Spanish test, and some examples of those are shown on the left-hand side of your slide. The entire test has two sets of pictures or test stimuli. This is one example of the two sets of art that will be presented to examinees. One set, the one on the left, was created for children ages 2 through 6'11", and the second set, the one on the right, is to be presented to examinees 7 and older. GFTA-3 Spanish can be used to assess older individuals whose speech is characterized by fair or poor intelligibility. While it was important to maintain a fun, engaging look for very young children taking the test, it was determined that older students would be more engaged using age-appropriate test stimuli. So the test offers two different styles of test stimuli so that you can present age-appropriate looking test content to your examinee. Here's another example showing the art. You can see the horse on the left is cartoony and cute, and the horse on the right is much more realistic looking. The images are intended to cater to your younger and older test takers. GFTA-3 Spanish measures phoneme production in multiple contexts. Here are some examples. When testing the prevocalic M, you will see that the test includes a variety of syllable shapes and contexts. The word mesa is a CV-CV structure, and the prevocalic M is included in the CV syllable. The prevocalic M in manzana is part of a CVC syllable, and the words manzana and durmiendo are both multisyllabic words. So the same phoneme is being tested with different levels of complexity and difficulty. On the bottom, you can see more examples of words testing the postvocalic S. So not only is the test probing each consonant sound, it's also probing for the production of these sounds in various contexts. That was a little bit of an overview of GFTA-3 Spanish, and now we'll talk about how to administer and score the test. The first question is, who can administer this test? A bilingual SLP with native or near native proficiency in Spanish. This person must be trained and experienced in administering and interpreting articulation tests, knowledgeable of speech sound disorders in the Spanish-speaking population, knowledgeable of Spanish phonological development and transcription using the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA, and knowledgeable of pronunciation differences among speakers of Spanish dialects. Additionally, an SLP that does not have native or near native proficiency in Spanish can collaborate with a bilingual professional, such as a speech-language pathology assistant or other bilingual professional like a school psychologist, an occupational or physical therapist, a diagnostician, or a teacher. This bilingual professional must also be trained on test administration and administer the question prompts and suggested cues only. If you are an SLP that will be working with a bilingual professional, you still must have knowledge of speech sound disorders in the Spanish-speaking population, phonological development in Spanish speakers, transcription using the IPA, dialectal differences among Spanish speakers. The SLP must also have training or experience in testing individuals from various linguistic and cultural backgrounds. If you don't meet these qualifications, defer testing to a bilingual SLP. When collaborating with a bilingual professional, additional preparation time and training between you and the bilingual professional is required. Before testing, meet with the bilingual professional to plan the content and format of the assessment session. During testing, the bilingual professional can deliver test stimuli and engage with the individual, while the SLP transcribes the individual's production of target words. The SLP should be present during testing to transcribe the responses answer the bilingual professional's questions, observe the individual's behavior, and intervene when necessary. After testing, you and the bilingual professional should discuss what occurred during the assessment session, review the individual's responses with the bilingual professional, and with the help of this professional, present the results to the individual if he or she is an adult, or to the individual's primary caregivers. The Sonidos en Palabras, or Sounds in Words test includes 50 target words that were selected carefully to minimize lexical variations. For example, in standardization, the word carro was included, but it was deleted in final publication because this word elicited many lexical variations. If you're familiar with the word car in Spanish, the translation can be different depending on the dialectal or regional influence. Some people may say carro, coche, auto, automóvil. Words that were specific to one particular geographical region or dialect were not included in this test. The Sonidos en Palabras test includes two sets of stimuli, one for younger individuals, referred to as the cartoon art, and another set for older individuals, referred to as realistic art. It is recommended that the cartoon art is administered to children ages 2 to 6'11", and the realistic art is administered to individuals ages 7 to 21'11". However, you can use the art style that the individual is more comfortable with. For example, if you're testing a 19-year-old with cognitive deficits, this person may prefer the cartoon art style rather than the realistic art style. So in those rare instances, you can use your professional judgment to decide what test stimuli to present. GFTA-3 Spanish measures 17 consonants, including 3 allophones for the intervocalic positions of B, D, and G, and 11 RNL clusters. All consonants in the target word are measured. Vowels are not accounted for in the total score. Each target word is elicited using a question prompt. The most common prompt is ¿Qué es esto? If the individual does not produce the target after 2 question prompts, you can use the suggested cue to elicit the target word. Completing the phonetic error analysis table provides a way to easily see error patterns by phoneme and syllable position. After completing the Sonidos en Palabras test, you can obtain norm reference scores. Sonidos en Palabras administration format. If you're familiar with GFTA-3 in English, you're already familiar with the test administration process. It's essentially the same. You present images and the individual names the image. If the individual doesn't label an image spontaneously, the test provides a suggested cue, or you can provide a different cue that follows the same format. So you can state the word, say something related to that word, say the question prompt. And if that doesn't work, the individual can imitate the target word. This is an image from the record form where you record the individual's responses. As you can see, all consonants in the word are scored. The first word is pato. There are 2 consonants in that word, a prevocalic P and an intervocalic T. Both consonants are scored. With this assessment tool, you're able to collect information on more than one sound production from a single target word. These are some more images from the record form as well. This section is called the phonetic error analysis. After completing the Sonidos en Palabras test, you can use the phonetic error analysis table to identify the individual's error patterns by looking at the place or location of the error within the syllable, so the prevocalic, intervocalic, or postvocalic positions. There's also a phonetic error analysis table for the RNL cluster errors that you can record separately. This is another view of the phonetic error analysis table. It allows you to really see patterns as they emerge not only by phoneme, but also the location in words and syllables. The phonetic error analysis table is also organized further to analyze the individual's error patterns by looking at the manner of production. So the table is also arranged by stops, nasals, approximates, fricatives, affricates, and liquids. The Sonidos en Palabras test allows you to obtain and report normative scores, including standard scores, percentile ranks, age equivalents, and growth scale values. GFTA-3 Spanish also includes the Sonidos en Oraciones test. The Sonidos en Oraciones is a sentence repetition task that assesses an individual's sound production of words in connected speech. Administration of the Sonidos en Oraciones can be very informative if an individual has a mild to moderate articulation disorder. That is, he or she can produce sounds correctly in simple context in single words, but intelligibility breaks down in connected speech. There are 2 stories, one for ages 4 through 6'11", and one for ages 7 and up. Story 1, Una visita al parque, a visit to the park, for ages 4 to 6'11", includes subject matter and vocabulary similar to younger individuals and is familiar to younger individuals and is illustrated with cartoon-style pictures. Story 2, No puedo abrir mis ojos, I can't open my eyes, for ages 7 to 21'11", includes subject matter and vocabulary that is more appropriate for older individuals and is illustrated with realistic style pictures. In the Sonidos en Oraciones test, in addition to assessing phoneme production, you can also rate the individual's intelligibility in connected speech as good, fair, or poor during the repetition of each sentence in this test. Similarly to Sonidos en Palabras, in the Sonidos en Oraciones test, all consonants in the target word are scored. So if you see the example with the arrow, the target words in the sentence are sol and brilla. To the right, you can see that there's a space to record errors in both the S and L consonants in the word sol, and likewise with the cluster and the consonant in the word brilla. In the phonetic error analysis table for Sonidos en Oraciones test, consonants are organized by stops, nasals, approximates, fricatives, affricates, and liquids, similar to the Sonidos en Palabras test. However, not all phonemes are represented here. As I mentioned earlier, the Sonidos en Oraciones test allows you to score the intelligibility of the individual's connected speech. The individual's production does not need to match the target sentence exactly for you to rate intelligibility. As long as the individual produces 2 or more words in connected speech, you can rate his or her intelligibility. So if the individual does not produce a sentence exactly as you said it, you can still rate the intelligibility as long as they produce 2 or more words. Based on your clinical judgment, you can rate the individual's intelligibility as good, fair, and poor. To calculate the intelligibility score, count the number of occurrences for each rating. So how many times did you rate the sentence as good? How many times did you rate it as fair, poor? And then if there were any instances where there was no response. Write the sums in the intelligibility rating subtotals box for the story you administered. So you'll start by recording the sum for rating 1 in the total of good ratings box, and then you'll add the sums for ratings 1, 2, 3, and 4. Record the total in the total for all ratings box. For Sonidos en Oraciones, ages 4 to 6'11", the total of all ratings will always be 15 unless the child produces less utterances. Divide the total of good ratings by the total of all ratings and multiply the quotient by 100. Record the value in the overall intelligibility rating. Intelligibility percentage can be recorded by using table C1 located in the manual. The values in the table represent the cumulative percentages of the normative sample that earned an intelligibility rating of less than 90% or above 90% by age. So in this particular case, 40% of individuals in the normative sample ages 5 to 5'11" obtained an intelligibility rating of less than 90%, and 60% of the individuals in the normative sample obtained an intelligibility rating of 90% or greater. The Sonidos en Oraciones test also offers normative scores, including standard scores, percentile ranks, age equivalents, gross scale values, and then additionally you have the intelligibility measure. Both the Sonidos en Palabras and Sonidos en Oraciones tests account for various variations in the production of consonants due to dialectal variations. For example, an individual who speaks Spanish from Puerto Rico will often aspirate the postvocalic S and substitute the postvocalic R for L. This is considered a dialectal variation and not an error. However, these substitutions may be considered errors if the individual speaks Spanish from Mexico. So the way the test is scored is dependent on the individual's cultural and dialectal background. This is another reason why it's so important that the examiner, the SLP, be familiar with the history and the dialect of the person that is being tested. We do promote dialect-sensitive scoring by offering information in the manual of variations to consider, but it is the responsibility of the SLP to have knowledge of the IPA symbols to record responses properly and how to interpret the results of the individual being tested. In order to represent a wide variety of individuals who speak a wide variety of Spanish dialects, the sample included individuals living in the United States, Puerto Rico, and Mexico. For additional dialectal variation, the primary caregiver reported the country of origin, and countries included Argentina, Colombia, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Puerto Rico, Spain, Uruguay, and Venezuela. All of these dialects are represented in the sample. So again, if the individual speaks a dialect, a specific dialect, that causes a variation in sound production, score it as correct. Don't penalize an individual for a dialectal variation. You can also document any changes in vowel production in the first page of the protocolo. Vowel errors are not accounted for in the total raw score, but it is definitely helpful to have this information available when analyzing data and writing a report. So there's another section on the record form, the protocolo, for observations and concerns that can be documented. If you perform an oral motor examination for symmetry or range of motion, or have the results from the last hearing assessment, this is a great section here to include that information. Once you have identified the individual's error patterns in the Sonidos en Palabras and Sonidos en Oraciones test, use the estimulación de consonantes y símfones, or the stimulability section, to determine the relative ease with which the individual can correctly produce previously misarticulated sounds at the syllable, word, and sentence level. So for GFTA-3 Spanish, these are your 3 administration and scoring options. You can use Q Interactive, which is an all-digital version using the 2 iPads. Q Interactive guides you through the entire test administration as you record responses on the fly. And scores are generated automatically as soon as the test is completed, along with a full report that can be printed out or edited. Q Global is a scoring platform that requires one web-enabled computer or tablet. You can purchase a digital manual and digital stimulus book to display the test stimuli to an examinee in a face-to-face or telepractice setting. You still purchase paper record forms to record responses. With Cube Global Scoring, you enter item-level information to obtain a score report. And you can order individual score reports or purchase a 1, 3, or 5-year unlimited use subscription. And you can also administer GFTA-3 Spanish using paper components and hand score it. All right, so we've discussed how to administer and score GFTA-3 Spanish. Now we're going to spend some time talking about interpreting the results. For both tests, meaning the sonidos en palabras and sonidos en oraciones test, there are separate norms for females and males. In general, the emergence and mastery of consonants and RNO clusters is very similar in both genders, but it's not identical. So if you look at the females, most sounds are developed by around 6 to 6'11", with the exception of later developing sounds like the fricative, like jabón, the intervocalic D, the tap R, the trill R, and the PR cluster. In males, most sounds are developed by 7 to 7'11", with the exception of later developing sounds like the tap R and the trill R. They're similar, but there's also differences among the genders. One of the things that we're really proud and excited to offer as part of the GFTA-3 Spanish is the emergence and mastery data. The premise is that phonemes should be tested in multiple contexts because productions can be affected by surrounding vowels and consonants and the complexity of the word structure. In addition, research shows that there is a range of phoneme acquisition with a time period between emergence and mastery of sounds. Phoneme mastery occurs gradually with increasing ability to produce the sound in multiple and more complex contexts. So what we're saying here is similar to what we know to be true for English sounds. And that is that sounds just don't show up when a child turns 7 or 8 or whenever they're expected to be mastered. There are some signs of emergence before mastery. Usually when sounds are emerging, they will show up in simpler contexts. For example, producing the M in mamá is easier than producing the same phoneme in the word manzana. All sound productions are not created equal. Even in single word productions, accurate production of the target phoneme is influenced by the context. Simple versus complex syllable shapes like CV, CVC, or clusters like CCV are not the same. Production changes when the target is next to other consonants, vowels, or clusters. Has speech sound developmental data really changed? Emergence is the age at which a phoneme is present in the child's repertoire. In the GFTA-3 Spanish, it's reported as the ages at which 50%, 75%, and 90% of the children spontaneously produced a phoneme correctly 1 or more times based on age and gender. Mastery is the age at which 90% of the GFTA-3 normative sample by gender produced the phoneme with at least 85% accuracy. Here is the emergence and mastery data for females, which is located on the back of the protocolo. The table on the top is the emergence of phonemes in females, and the bottom is the mastery data. Low standard scores indicate that a child's speech is not comparable to same-age gender peers. Table PR1 at the top shows the ages at which 50%, 75%, and 90% of typically developing children use each phoneme in 1 or more contexts. You can compare the information to the examinee's performance. Table PR2 at the bottom shows age of mastery for each sound by gender. When should a child be able to say a sound one or more times on the GFTA-3 Spanish? Let's look at the marked arrows for examples in table PR1. We're going to look specifically for the emergence of the trill R. The trill R is produced in words like ratón and perro. At age 2.6 to 2.11, 50% of the female children in the normative sample were producing this sound at least once during the test. At age 3.6 to 3.11, 75% of the female sample was producing a trill R, and by 5.6 to 5.11, 90% were producing the trill R at least one time during the test administration. So if a female child at age 6 is not producing the sound at all, this should be a red flag given the data on emergence. So if you're testing a female this age who did not produce this sound at least once, she's at risk of not mastering the sound by the expected age it should be mastered. Here's the mastery data. When should a child be able to say a sound correctly with at least 85% accuracy? So we're going to look at table PR2, which shows mastery data for females. And if you look down to the 8 to 8.11 age band, you're going to see the red arrow highlighting when the trill R should be mastered in the prevocalic position. The purpose of this slide is to show you how close the data from GFTA-3 Spanish lines up to the data that already exists out there. So this table is from firstyears.org. The website's there in blue. This is a resource that you would typically find if you do a Google search for Spanish phoneme development. As you can see on the chart, P, B, and M are mastered by around 3.5. They're the first sounds to be mastered. Although this chart does not separate norms by gender, but the table also highlights when these sounds emerge. So very early on in the sounds shown here, and when they're expected to be mastered is where the highlighted portion ends. Very similar data to what is presented on the back of your GFTA-3 Spanish protocolo. In this slide, we have documented a child's productions at different ages. So this is Ana at age 2 years, 2 months, 4.2, 6.2, and 6.8. We know that a young child is not expected to produce later developing sounds. Ana's scores are not depressed at age 2 years, 2 months if she doesn't produce later developing sounds like the trill R, the tap R, and R clusters. At this age, she earns a standard score that is within the high average range at 114. Similarly, at age 4.2, Ana still scores within the average range from producing the same types of errors. However, at age 6.2, Ana's scores are considered to be within the low or borderline range with a score of 80. By 6.8, if she still produces the same errors she was producing at age 2.2 with the trill R, the tap R, and R clusters, her standard score will be in the low range at 76. So this is to highlight an example of what happens when nothing is done to intervene when later developing sounds that should be emerging do not emerge. Standard scores are going to be fine until a certain point. But based on data that we have available, it's predictable that her gap will widen if she continues to get no support. Let's talk a little bit about best practice here. So I've gone over how to administer and score the test with you, but you should also know that the GFTA-3 Spanish score should never be the sole determiner for eligibility of services. The GFTA-3 Spanish score is not a comprehensive assessment. The GFTA-3 Spanish score indicates how a child compares to same age, same gender peers. The clinician, SLP, determines the appropriate next steps based on all the information collected. GFTA-3 Spanish standard scores provide one part of the evidence you report as part of a comprehensive assessment. Interpreting assessment results. what we know to be best practice. Examine standard scores to determine how an individual functions relative to peers, and examine emergence and mastery data to identify phonemes that should be emerging in the individual's repertoire and should be mastered by individuals at the same age. In addition to the normative scores, you have more information to analyze that will help you make a decision about diagnosis and treatment. You can also use qualitative data obtained with GFTA-3 Spanish. Based on the child's age and gender, note their performance and or improvements during the assessment or in conversation. Collect a phoneme inventory to find out what sounds the child is or is not producing. Analyze correct and incorrect phoneme productions in different syllable shapes and word contexts. Again, with the example of the prevocalic M, it's not the same to produce the phoneme in a CV syllable as it is to produce it in a CVC syllable. So with GFTA-3 Spanish, you can look at the context of syllable structures, look for developmental patterns, check for stimulability, note the quality of productions in connected speech, and the intelligibility in words and sentences. In addition to the GFTA-3 Spanish results, obtain data from any of the following. Collect a spontaneous connected speech sample, interview parents, caregivers, ask about behaviors at home, concerns, and ask what their priorities are. Interview teachers, ask about academic, social, emotional impact in the classroom, participation. Observe the child in various contexts with peers, with adults, in different settings like the cafeteria or the classroom. You can also do dynamic assessment to identify techniques that elicit correct productions and carryover. So we have covered administering and scoring the test, and now we'll talk about interpreting the results and what your recommendations can be. So first, parents and teachers want to know that their concerns about a child's speech are being addressed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that enrollment in therapy is the next step. You can monitor the child's speech in the classroom, do a recheck in 6 months or in a given amount of time, note if there's improvement, note if there's any new facilitating contexts that were acquired independently, which would be the emergence of sounds, and what are the implications? So what's the academic impact? What do their grades look like? What are the social implications? Do they have a group of friends? There's also the possibility of enrollment in a classroom articulation lab. I know many speech-language pathologists are doing this with large groups to practice developing sounds in a more general context. Giving the parents strategies is often very helpful. Giving caregivers strategies and tips for how to address speech errors and possibly work on sounds at home can always be a recommendation. And placement in speech and language services, of course, if the child demonstrates a need. One of the most common concerns that we hear from SLPs who contact us is, how do I explain these results? Sometimes test results don't meet various expectations, and the SLPs really put on the spot about how to stand by their findings and explain the results. So we've created some common scenarios that many of you have probably been in. The first is explaining test results to parents and teachers. The expectation is that the parent or teacher expects the child to earn a low score. The results are that the parent or teacher concerns and priorities do not match expectations on the GFTA-3 Spanish test results. The child earns a GFTA-3 Spanish score in the average range. The explanation is When producing sounds, your child student makes errors that some children her age make. She's able to imitate the sounds correctly, which is a positive sign that she will learn to produce the sounds correctly on her own, given a little more time. This would be a perfect opportunity to give the parent and teacher some strategies to help the child and offer to follow up with them in a given amount of time to see if they know any improvement. The second scenario is explaining test results when results don't match your expectations. So the clinician expects the child to earn an average score because errors are on later developing sounds. But the child earns a low GFTA-3 Spanish score. The explanation: the child does not produce later developing sounds in any of the words tested. When examining the emergence data, a boy his age or younger was able to produce these sounds correctly in one or more instances. Intelligibility may be fair to good, however, he was unable to imitate the sounds correctly, which is a poor prognostic indicator that he will learn to produce the sounds correctly without additional support, meaning support at home, the classroom, or direct therapy. This is why the emergence and mastery tables are so important for you to reference when analyzing scores. So if you remember our example of the young girl who is not producing the trill R, yes, she may be only 6 years old, but she's not producing the sound at all. Her standard score is going to be lower than her same age gender peers, and it's a red flag that her development is not on track. So there needs to be some sort of intervention to prevent that gap from widening. And again, intervention does not always mean direct speech therapy. There are several ways to intervene and provide support. It's just a matter of putting all the pieces of data together and using clinical judgment to make appropriate recommendations. This next scenario is explaining test results to administrators. The expectation is that administrators and districts require an academic impact to provide services. So the results are that the administrator's view of academic impact does not match the clinician's view of the need for services. So how does the clinician explain? The student does not produce the sounds trill and tap R, S, and R and L clusters in any of the words that were tested. He was unable to imitate these sounds correctly, which is a poor prognostic indicator that he will learn to produce these sounds correctly without additional support. And then additionally, the student's errors negatively impact intelligibility, so that teachers have difficulty understanding his oral responses in class. Teasing from peers has resulted in him becoming more withdrawn, significantly reducing his participation in the classroom. So not only is it important to explain test scores, it's also important to have data and report data that explains the impact of an individual's day-to-day interactions. Explaining test results to funding entities. So the funding entity requires a standard score of 77 to fund services, and funding entities can be like insurance or Medicaid. The results are that the child earns a GFTA-3 Spanish score of 78, so 1 point away, and the clinician recommends that the child receive direct services. The explanation. The child's results from a comprehensive assessment of articulation shows her articulation skills to be at the very low range of ability. She incorrectly produces 13 speech sounds, which significantly reduces intelligibility. The percentile rank on the GFTA-3 Spanish places her at the 7.1 percentile.
Actually, that's an error. It should just be
7th percentile. Stimulability, which is the ability to imitate correct productions of sounds, was poor. She was stimulable for 5 of 13 error sounds, indicating a poor prognosis for spontaneous improvement of sound productions without intervention. When using any assessment, a standardized test or a non-standardized procedure, there's a certain amount of measurement error, especially when testing human behavior. When using a standardized test, best practice is to report the earned score with the confidence band, which is the range of scores where the hypothetic true score lies, as well as additional data from other assessment procedures, such as your connected speech sample, stimulability information, intelligibility information. Certain funding entities will accept only a single score from a standardized test without reporting the confidence interval or other assessment data. Individual funding entities set criteria for eligibility of services that will be funding. Test scores are not set to yield scores of average or 77 and below, so you will not always be able to obtain a score that meets the criterion of the funding entity. So what happens if a stakeholder does not accept your recommendations based on assessment results? We recommend that you document all test results and considerations to support your recommendations for the student or individual. Norms cannot be adjusted to meet ever-changing legislative, district, and insurance requirements for a student's eligibility for services. But you can consider and offer recommendations for alternatives to direct treatment. So these are the recommendations that we talked about earlier. Just some examples for you to consider. You can monitor the child and retest in a certain amount of time. You can provide consultation in the classroom, giving teachers tips and strategies, maybe some activities that they can work on. Likewise at home, giving the parents picture cards, little activities and tips and strategies is very helpful. And then, of course, if there's the opportunity to be enrolled in something like an articulation lab in the classroom, that can be very helpful as well. For this last part of the presentation, I want to spend some time telling you about the GFTA-3 Spanish sensitivity and specificity. The GFTA-3 Spanish Sonidos en Palabras scores have a positive correlation with the PLS-5 Spanish articulation screener scores. If you're familiar with the PLS-5 Spanish, it has an articulation screener that allows you to probe sounds that are appropriate for young children. So we did a validity study, and it indicated that both tools measure similar speech sound abilities. Additionally, we did a study with individuals with speech sound disorders and a matched control group from the normative sample. The standard difference is the effect size, which expresses the difference between two scores in SD units. This enables a comparison of discrepancy scores across tests. Effect sizes of 0.5 are considered moderate, and 0.8 and above are considered large. If you look at the table below and scan to the right, you can see the reported effect sizes are large at 2.35 and 1.42 for sonidos en palabras and sonidos en oraciones respectively. These results highlight the ability of the GFTA-3 Spanish to discriminate between typically developing individuals and those with speech sound disorders. More evidence of validity is found by looking at sensitivity and specificity. For ages 2-6 to 7-11, the optimal cut score is 1 standard deviation below the mean, which yields a standard score of 85. The sensitivity, which is the probability that individuals who identified with a speech sound disorder have a speech sound disorder, was 0.88. And specificity, which is the probability that individuals who do not have a speech sound disorder were correctly classified, was a 0.91. And we used a pool of bilingual SLP's determination of a speech sound disorder based on the criteria that they use in their practice, which included standardized test results, language sampling, observations, and informal assessment. So we've reached the end of the presentation. I'm going to look and see if we have any questions in the chat box. Please make sure you're not trying to use the audio feature for questions, as that has been disabled. Most of the questions.
Here's one that.
Okay, so there's a question that says, can you explain?
Sorry.
It says, can you explain a little bit more about the articulation lab in the classroom? Okay, so from what I understand, and this looks differently for every school and every district, but a lot of speech-language pathologists are serving students in general education by not addressing an IEP or not addressing a specific goal per se, but addressing sounds in general. And so they start typically with first developing sounds and move on down the line. So the class can consist of children who do not have individualized education plans, but may need a little bit of extra support. And so there's nothing in terms of special education curriculum that they're following. They're just following kind of general guidelines for overall speech sound development. And a lot of times, if SLPs are not doing this in a designated articulation lab or classroom, they go into a lot of preschool or kindergarten classrooms and just do general lessons about speech sound development. So that's just a recommendation and something that can be considered. If there's a lot of children that are located in the school that you work, for example, that may have some difficulties, but not difficulties that would indicate that they need direct speech and language therapy. Okay, question about English students learning in Spanish classrooms. Bilingual, biliterate programs are the norms for Trill R Emergence mastery. Okay, well the test, the GFTA-3 Spanish, was normed on individuals who speak Spanish primarily, and individuals who speak Spanish and English equally. So if the children that you're working with speak English more than Spanish, then this normative sample does not represent that population. I'm not sure if that answers the question. When you stated 77 for funding and it was 78, yeah, that was meaning that the individual did not qualify for the funding entities, did not meet the qualifications for funding, basically. So the scoring just didn't meet the qualifications. However, the clinician did recommend services. In the sounds and sentences portion, can you have the child repeat the whole sentence? Yes, if you've used the suggested cue. Yeah, it's actually the sounds and sentences portion. It is a sentence repetition task. So you will say the sentence and have the child repeat the sentence. Okay. You mentioned that measuring intelligibility can be done by 1 or 2 words. Can you give an example? Okay. So let me see if I can find a sentence here to provide you with an example. For sonidos en oraciones, for example, one of the sentences here is, la niña se pone sus zapatos. So if the child does not repeat that sentence exactly, let's say the child says, la niña pone zapatos. So she's missing a few words in that sentence. As long as the child says, 2 or more words, you can rate their intelligibility. Was it good? Was it fair? Was it poor? And so you may not be able to rate their or score their target word productions in that sentence, but you will be able to score their intelligibility.
This one was about 77 or 78. Does the IDEA rule apply here?
Well, we were just talking in terms, we were just giving a scenario in terms of whatever a funding entity would require for their qualifications. So it was just a general number. Different funding entities have different qualifying scores that they want to see in order to fund services. So that was just an example. An example of what happens when a child doesn't meet the qualifications of the funding entity. Okay, I'm glad I answered your question, Edward. Thank you. Okay, this one. Someone is saying, I have had students with language disorders or recalling issues that were unable to repeat the stimulus sentence. All right, well, then you can administer the sonidos en palabras test, but you may not be able to administer the sonidos en oraciones test. I'm sure there are other ways that you can elicit some sort of language sampling and judge or rate their intelligibility based on their connected speech.
You wouldn't use score.
You wouldn't use, yeah. No, I mean, you wouldn't be able to administer the sonidos en oraciones test if they're not able to repeat the stimulus sentence, so you wouldn't be able to use the scores from that test. Next question is, what recommendations would you make to the English SLP regarding which sounds to work on if he is non-English speaking but has errors in Spanish? Okay, I understand. So the child has errors in Spanish, does not speak English, but the SLP is an English speaker. What I would recommend first is looking at sounds that Spanish and English have in common. There are quite a few. I know there are quite a few differences as well, but I would recommend starting there. The sounds that, starting with the sounds that an English speaker and a Spanish speaker have in common that are not being produced by the Spanish speaker.
This will be the last question, and then I need to go over CE information again.
Okay, last question is a scoring question. Is that?
No, sorry. Let me go back up.
We're trying to look for the last question here. Okay, scoring question. When there are two consonants in one box, does each consonant get counted as an error? For example, the student said diete for dientes. Is this counted as 2 errors or 1 error? So every target word will have the consonants counted for. And if there are different consonants that are being misarticulated, then that'll be 2 errors. If there's only 1 consonant in the word that has 2 consonants, then it would only be counted for as 1 error. So every consonant in the word would be measured as a potential error to be scored on the test. And I think that's all the time we have.
If you all would like to send additional questions, you can contact us either at patricia.ibarra@pearson.com or nancy.castilleja@pearson.com, and we'll see if we can get the answers to you after this session. If you're listening to this live webinar on August 22nd and want to earn CEUs, be sure to mail the forms that are on your most recent email that has PDFs of the ASHA participant form and the evaluation form. You'll send them to Darlene Davis here at Pearson. Here's the address. It'll be on your handout as well. And the deadline for submitting the forms is August 29th, not August 24th. No CEUs are offered for the recording of this session on the Pearson website that will be up in a few weeks. We thank you for joining us today and for your participation and questions. We appreciate it. And like I said, if you have any additional questions, be sure and contact us directly.